Very good. Good evening, everyone. This is our second lesson, and my apologies in advance if I'm a little unorganized here. I just got back from a 5-day trip late last night, and I'm still trying to catch up. Anyway, so our task for tonight, our main task is to, as I said last time, to talk through pretty much the entire rocket build. And one of your main tasks before you actually do the build is to plan the build. So step 0 in all of the lists that you might have, step 0 is always make a plan. And in the case of a rocket build, it's important because certain things have to be done first and other things can be done in parallel. And certain things, you literally can't do the next step if you mess this one up or glue this too early or something like that. So making a very explicit plan is really important. And so essentially that's your homework in part, is to make a plan and to send us your plan so that we can see it and that you need to follow it and we'll give you some feedback on it. My expectation is that you will finish your entire rocket build within 3 weeks. But in the next week and the week after that, we will give you other things to do as well. So it's not the only thing you'll be doing in these 3 weeks, but pretty much 3 weeks from tonight, we want every team to have a finished, completed rocket, and then we'll talk about finishing it as in, now, if you want to paint it, if you want to do various things, here's some extra stuff. So make a plan. Here's what I'd like to do right now. I'd like to, what do I want to do right now? I want to go to the repository. Sorry. They aren't automatically linked. Only not automatically linking, and not even working. What's going on? Okay, sorry about the delay. So basically, this is what the document repository now looks like, and we are doing lesson 2, which has homework and vocabulary. I want to point out that I made a small adjustment to the tote photos. It wasn't actually a photo adjustment at all. It was one more thing that you really need access to. That's a soldering iron, so that's why this says tote photos version 2. I added one thing to the list of things that you really want to have available to you. And I think that's basically it. So let's do the following. Let's just take a quick look at this. Here's the homework. So basically what we want you to do is have at least somebody on the team take a look at a bunch more chapters in the high power rocketry book, including a chapter that's about how to build a rocket more similar in complexity to the one we're building. And also the flight readiness review. Yes, I've also posted that. I'll show that to you next. And then you should have received some additional parts for your tote, and there are yet some more parts still to come that have to do with the av bay. I'll send those out even later. But why don't you just add the stuff, the part to your kit and your motor casing and your insert, add all of those to your tote and we'll use those. But remember that a bunch of things aren't going to be sent to you ever because they're going to be provided on the day that we actually launch these things. And then here are your homework exercises, the first of which, the most important of which, frankly, is to make a very serious build schedule with explicit dates and names of people by Monday, please. It should say by Monday. That was from 2 years ago. Actually, by Monday is fine, but frankly, you should have gotten a lot of it done by next Monday because that's a week into a 3-week build. So Get us a build schedule as soon as you possibly can, and we'll get back to you. Aim to be finished building within 3 weeks, preferably less than that even. And send that to your advisor, and send that to me, send that to Sophia, and we'll give you some feedback on it. And then stick to your build schedule. And if we tell you to change it, and then stick to your build schedule. And as I already mentioned, we're doing other things in the next couple of weeks, and there will be additional homework besides building for those weeks. Okay, here's the repository, and Sophia hasn't shared with me yet, but I think she will soon. A place to go to see some information about her build, and as soon as I have that, I will update this document and repost it. Second thing, and that is the flight readiness review slide. So let's just take a quick look at this. Basically, I want you to do essentially one written report, except we're not really going to, or one, well, it's slides for an oral report, but we won't actually talk through the slides. We'll just use them as background material as we do your final safety check. So basically here are templates showing you what we want on these slides, including a photograph of you and your whole team and your rocket when it's done, and names of your team members, and then some statements about what you got, open rocket parts with labels on them, parts lists, especially modified parts. We'll talk about a few of those tonight, and your schedule, your construction timeline, and also photos. This is important to take photos, especially of things that eventually won't be visible. So you need to take photos as you go so that you have evidence of the fact that you did something, even though we can't see it when the rocket is completed. Here's some links to instrumentation, the altimeter 2 data logger, the AIM-USB altimeter, which you don't yet have, the radio beeper, and the Mobius action camera if you decide to fly a camera. I'll lend those items to you. Read up a little bit about them and talk about them a little bit. Here's where you will do flight trajectory predictions. We'll talk about this more in future weeks. And team management. This is also something that you should do right away, is how is our team going to be organized? In particular, who's going to be the person who is most in touch with the organizers, me and Sophia, for instance, who are the people, perhaps more than one, who are going to be on these calls, and who's going to become the open rocket guru. You really need at least one person to do that, and who's going to be doing the building, if not everybody, and in what order. Okay, so those are items for the flight readiness review, and we want that finished and submitted before you do your final checkout. So think about the due date for this as right after the last all team lesson. So right before Thanksgiving is another way to put that. And the third thing is rocketry vocabulary. So here are the things we're going to be talking about tonight. I will go back to these in a moment. Before I do those, Sophia, anything that I'm missing? Okay, so what I think I'm going to do is run through these vocabulary concepts, and then we can go straight into a discussion about the FinCan exercise and how that went for people, and also talk about what you got and how much you've done so far. And very good. So as far as rocketry vocabulary concepts, we talked last week about the fact that a forged eye bolt, we provided you with several. We want you not to use the eye bolts that were provided with the kit. They're probably actually okay for this lightweight kit, but in actuality, forged eye bolts and lock nuts are much better, and so we want you to get used to using those. We'll talk about epoxy fillets in a moment when we get into epoxy issues and advice. Masking with painter's tape. I brought you some painter's tape, Sophia. So now you have some. No more complaining.
Yes.
We're using rocket epoxy for the most part, but we've also provided you with JB Weld for high temperature applications, of which there aren't that many on this particular rocket. Usually that would be used if you are using epoxy to attach a motor retention, but in fact, this rocket came with a motor retention that didn't require epoxy. West Systems is actually a much less expensive type of epoxy, but it has its own issues, not the least of which is it's really runny. So when you first mix it up, so typically what you want to do is add powder to that stuff to make it stiff. The powder doesn't change the chemistry, but it does make it stiffer until it gets to a reasonable consistency. Rocket epoxy will sort of do this automatically for you, but West Systems is significantly less expensive than rocket epoxy. KB weld is significantly more expensive than rocket epoxy. We won't actually put wood blocks inside of our rocket, but it's worth knowing about, so we might mention them on and off. It's like put wood inside this part of the rocket so that you can screw something in and have something on the back side that it screws into. Just make sure that if there's parachutes moving around in that part of the rocket, you don't snag them. Otherwise, you can also just epoxy things to the outside, like for instance, a camera mount could be epoxy to the outside or screwed into a wood block on the inside, in which case you could move it from rocket to rocket, which might be useful. Recovery harness, that's sometimes called shock cord, especially for small rockets. We call it recovery harness for these high power rockets. Make sure that you use approved knots and that your knots are tied before you or while you can still reach the things you're tying them to. We'll tend to use quick links so that we can take parachutes on and off easily, but not quick links every single place where you could imagine. And the flight readiness review, I already mentioned that. There's a link to where to get to these documents. And, you know, I think what we should do, Sophia, before we dive into epoxy and stuff, let's look at a rocket. Essentially a finished rocket that's comparable in complexity to the one that you're building. And so this rocket, some of you actually saw this rocket already at North Branch. It's called Meteor. It was built in one of my classes. And so I think it might be interesting if you want to just handle the camera, and I will literally walk my way right through this rocket, not so much top to bottom, but rather in the order in which things happen to the rocket while it flies. Can you make me big on anybody's screen, including my screen? Oh, got it. Okay, so here's the deal. I'm going to just point this so I can see what the view is, and then I'm going to hand you this camera. So, and I just want you to do your best to watch me. Here we go. Okay, so here's the rocket. Very good. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to speak loudly and hold it slightly sideways. Sure, great. Okay, so if I'm going to fly this particular rocket, first of all, let me point out a few things. One is that it has guides here. You'll actually use what are called rail buttons, but it has something to hold it to the rail to make sure that it goes up the rail properly. And here is a spent motor in a case. And so when I thread it into the case, it actually ends up with a slight lip here. And so to fly the rocket, I would insert that into the motor mount tube. It turns out that this one actually has some washers here, which are sort of a cheap way to retain the motor and keep it from coming back out. And right now they're screwed in, so I can't get this in. So, okay, we'll just have to pretend. So if I'm going to launch the rocket, I would insert the motor, and then once it's on the rail, I would turn on the electronics, and then I would insert an igniter, and then someone else would press the button to fire the rocket. And so now the rocket the motor is burning here, and I'm just watching if anybody shows up wanting to get into the room. Okay, so first of all, the motor, which is down here, burns, and I pick up a lot of speed, and then the motor burns out, and it smokes a lot. Okay, so while the motor is burnt out, the rocket is coasting to apogee, and hopefully at the time it reaches apogee, two things will happen approximately the same time. One is that the avionics bay electronics will say, time for a parachute, and will pressurize this section of the rocket and blow it apart right below the collar. So here's the collar, and it will come apart right here. Boom, so this thing comes off. Similarly, the motor itself has a motor eject, and so the motor eject will also pressurize that, possibly at about the same time. One way or another, we're going to get this part of the rocket apart, and notice that these two sections of the rocket are tied together with recovery harness. The only thing that's missing is an actual parachute. I thought there was one in here, I guess not. We would have fixed that before we flew it. And then, of course, something to protect the parachute, like a flame protector. So here it is, the bottom of the rocket. Now the rocket is descending. And notice that the attachment point for the parachute is actually pretty close to the top of the rocket, so that when this hangs down at the end of this long harness, it doesn't actually hit this part, which is hanging down at the end of this short harness. So I want the two of them to hang down from this point. This one will swing high, and that one will swing low, and they will miss each other, hopefully. Okay. So now I continue, and now I'm on my way down under one parachute. So I'm descending. The two parts of the rocket are descending approximately this way. There's a parachute above, and it's maybe not very big. It's a drogue parachute. And then as I approach the ground, the electronics in the avionics bay, which is right here, it's that coupler tube with electronics in it, will sense that I'm getting close to the ground, will fire another explosive charge. And the key is, when I pressurize the upper section of the rocket, I need this part to come apart and not this part. The way I'm going to keep that from happening is I'm going to use rivets here that keep the avionics bay attached to this upper section, but I will blow the nose cone off. And then when the nose cone comes off, it will come out and, oh, again, no parachute. That's where I would have a bigger parachute. Okay, so eventually now I have everything dangling down from a bigger parachute, and the drogue parachute is almost superfluous by this point, and hopefully it will land safely. Notice that the nose cone has a hole in it, which is a modification that we'll make so that we can put a forged eye bolt here. So we can put like a radio beeper inside the nose cone. And then it also has someplace along this section will be an attachment point for the parachute. Again, chosen so that when things hang down from that point, they hopefully don't hit each other, bang into each other on descent. It can happen, but we don't want to make it happen if it doesn't have to. There it is. That's approximately how the rocket flies. It goes up, it comes apart partially, it comes down, it comes apart more thoroughly, and it lands. And the rocket, that's dual deploy. So you will be building a rocket that operates just about that way. She said that we stole the parachutes and put them in the split rocket and showed them to you last week. So imagine, there need to be parachutes in that for it to fly safely. Okay, so that's what we're building. We're building a rocket to do basically that. And now it's time for us to talk about epoxies first, and the kit and the order in which to build the kit perhaps second. So I'm going to maybe let you lead this part of our discussion. And I have with me, if we want to do any demonstrating, and I'm not saying we should, but if we want to do any demonstrating, I have this here, we have tape, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to point this at you. Just make sure you speak up and tell people what you'd like them to know about the fin can exercise. In fact, we should have everybody hold up their little fin can and just maybe get a few comments from at least a few teams about how that went. So let's do that right now. If you have a fin can, hold it up. If you don't have a fin can, look embarrassed because you're supposed to. Hold up a fin can close to the camera if possible. And then here's what I'm going to do actually. Hey, this is looking great. I'm going to ask in alphabetical order, more or less, for each team to say one thing that they noticed about this exercise. And I would like the next team not to say the same thing, but something different if possible. So I'm going to literally start alphabetically. I won't always do this with somebody representing Augsburg. So anybody on the Augsburg team who's on the line, one thing that was easy or hard, or you would like to share about the fin can exercise. Augsburg.
Hi, everybody. My name is Leon. I'm from Augsburg. It went pretty okay, but we figured out that we put on the epoxy too thin, and that's why one side didn't actually harden.
Aha, okay, good point.
Besides that, everything else went pretty okay.
Okay, so Bethel, any comments besides you need enough epoxy to make sure things don't fall back off again? Bethel?
We ran into putting on too much initially, so then we had to start scraping, and turned out a little uglier maybe than we wanted, but.
Okay, good point. So it turns out that you're both right, as in you need to put on some, and if you put on too little, you should add some, and if you put on too much, you should scrape it off. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that, in fact, in a moment. Century, anything you'd like to share besides what has already been shared?
Hi, I didn't have too much trouble with this. It went fairly smoothly. It came out very ugly. I didn't have too much time to sand it down, but I noticed that the epoxy didn't harden. It was tacky enough for it to be able to stick to it just with friction and kind of hold itself there. So I didn't need to clamp it or anything. But it did take a while for it to, it has a lot of work time, I noticed, about at least 30 minutes, and it was still like, you could still take it off and like reposition if needed.
Okay, so one quick comment. You said you didn't take the time to sand it down. We're going to try and teach you how to put epoxy on so it does not require sanding, because frankly, sanding epoxy is possible and it's a big nuisance. And if you can get the epoxy on well enough, you don't have to sand it, or not very much at least. So that's something we're going to watch for. Duluth, you're sort of next, sort of alphabetically. Duluth, any comments? I'm not hearing anybody from Duluth. Are you muted? Do we have somebody from Duluth on board?
I saw we did. They might not have been.
Hello.
There we go.
Yes. Comments about this exercise?
We put on, I think, enough epoxy. It took longer to cure than I thought. So that was mostly it. I was trying to walk home and hold it at the same time, and that's probably not what you should do.
Probably not, but it's good to know how long the epoxy takes. And I would suggest that you, every time you start a new epoxy, you see what it does and how long it lasts. So for instance, the West Systems will do something pretty funky just before it gets hard. It gets really hot. So you know if it's getting hot, oh man, we're just about out of the ability to work on it. Rock epoxy, not necessarily, but that's just something you want to notice about epoxies, is how long you have to work with them and what they do as they get harder and harder. Fond du Lac, any comments? Fond du Lac, you're muted.
Oh,
We're here. Yeah, take it away.
yeah, we just applied some pieces to a spent reusable unit here. It was interesting. You know, I don't know if you can see this.
We can see that, and it does look interesting. So besides the fact that I've never seen a spoon-shaped fin, but that's fine. One thing you obviously need to do is make sure that your fins are well aligned with the axis of the rocket and very perpendicular. And frankly, those two things can go south in two different ways. So yes, but for this activity, you're welcome to glue most anything as long as it's sort of like a fin. We're going to get serious about real fins in a moment. Hamlin, anything to add to what's been said already?
I currently don't have any rocket materials with me in my apartment, so can't show
you know
anything.
Did anybody on your team do this activity?
Let's see who's here actually.
So this is actually kind of important. I don't need everybody on every team to be on the call. I need the people who are on the call to know what everybody has done, and if necessary, to have it ready to show us on the call. So work that out, Hamlin. But do you know, Calvin, whether or not this was tried by anybody on your team?
Not. Oh,
Our team hasn't been able to meet. I'm hoping that we will all meet this Thursday.
Okay, that's fine. I would suggest you do this activity, even though it was homework for last week, as well as go ahead and lay out your schedule and perhaps get started on the real deal. Inverhill.
Okay, so Anna and I also, we both did, we did the project. We also have other people who did the project, but weren't able to make it on. I think it's kind of bright, but you can see that they're pretty clean. And so is Anna's down there. We have another person who worked on the project. I think what we can say that other people haven't said is these are not great to work on outside in the cold.
That's true. That's a good point. You definitely want to be working on these inside, and if possible, although I realize this is an ask, it would be good to have a place that everybody on the team can get to, like on campus, that's maybe dedicated, so that you can leave it there after you're done with your epoxy and nobody will disturb it. That's an ask, but that's something to aspire toward.
What we found is that it doesn't set quicker in the cold, but it hardens. So you can actually, like, if you really wanted to, you can get it to harden and set it into place and then set it up. And then when you come into the warm, it's kind of moves around a little bit more. So you have some more time to work with it before it ultimately sets. So it's kind of a weird mixture of delayed setting, but also hardening in advance.
that's interesting. I would suggest maybe don't try to take advantage of that. On the other hand, I have heard of people who will have like a heat gun, and they'll use the heat gun to get the stuff back a little bit workable after it really has hardened, in hopes of fixing something. But one thing that I was thinking about for all of you, I just noticed it mostly with the rocket that you were just showing, Kelly, is the fact that you want to get your fins exactly a certain number of angles apart, right? 90 degrees apart, 120 degrees apart, and that can be tricky, especially for surface mount. Although if you have a commercially built kit which has slots that are machined for you, then perhaps it's not that difficult to get them exactly the right angle. Normandale, anything to add to what we've been talking about?
Yes. So this was ours here, and we were able to meet in our team's or our school's fab lab to work on it. And like others, we kind of had to experiment a little bit with the amount of epoxy, and we also were kind of surprised by the amount of time it took to cure. One thing that we found helpful, we had this kind of triangular device which fit over the actual cylinder and around the fins. And it would slide all the way down. We'd put the fins on there like that. And that was very helpful with alignment, but even more importantly, it was helpful to protect the fins while they were curing. So yeah, but overall it's a good experience, and yeah, thank you.
That's great. So it turns out you're kind of stealing Sophia's thunder, but that's fine because she wanted to talk to you about a few of our recommendations, one of which is hold the fins after you finish putting epoxy on them for some hours. I mean, basically, sometimes these epoxies say, look, it's workable for an hour, but you really want to let it set for 24 hours before you really have full strength. So it doesn't have to be laser cut, although that's handy, but you can make those things out of cardboard. And getting those things, that's just one possibility. There's other ways to hold fins, with tape. In fact, Sophia, what would you recommend? I mean, can we just make even a list, and we could even draw the list or write the list on the board here? Some recommendations when it comes to epoxy, one of which is going to be perhaps hold it in place with something like that.
Yeah. So I think this is a really great way to hold in your fins when you're waiting for them to dry, because it's like a way to guarantee that they will be in a consistent angle, especially because you create this in SolidWorks. If you have a good laser cutter, it's very accurate. You can also do something like cardboard. You could maybe use some sort of X-Acto knife to really eyeball it. That sounds like a lot of work to me though. I would say if you have access to a laser cutter, this is a great way.
On the other hand, the one you have there is for holding fins as they're being glued to an airframe, but we're going to glue our fins first to a motor mount tube, so it has to be a different shape than that, at least somewhat, right? So the central hole, for instance, has to be much smaller.
Oh yeah. So this for this rocket, actually, they want us to tack it through the walls.
Oh, I see. Okay,
Yeah.
in which case that would be about the right thing.
Yes.
That's cool.
Yeah. So this for the kit rocket, you'll kind of notice some of the instructions. After you epoxy the two of the centering rings on, the next step is actually to tack in the fins, which is a little bit different than I would usually do. But I've been following the instructions, and this suggests you just use a thin line of epoxy and pop the fin in there. And then as a way to hold them in place, I use this fin guide, or I will use this fin guide just to make absolute sure there's no drooping or sagging. But yeah, I think this is a great way to hold them in place. If maybe you don't have access to a laser cutter, another option that I've seen people on the rocket team use is typically to do one fin at a time, you'll use masking tape, and you'll tape from the tip here right onto the body with a tight piece of masking tape, and that'll make sure it's in there and it stays straight. If you use that method, you want to make sure like you kind of have to eyeball it to make sure you're not like making it tilt this way or this way. You want to make sure you have even force on each side, and you can keep it upright. And that you usually have to do one fin at a time, because obviously if you turn it, tape might droop and then your fin might droop.
So that's a good point. The slots in the airframe will make sure that it is aligned along the axis, but will not guarantee that it's going to be perpendicular, and you need to do both.
Right.
So let me actually show you one thing. I'm going to go over to the whiteboard. And what don't you actually hold that a little closer to me if necessary, but I just want to draw something quickly here. So if this is something on which I want to put a fin in view, and if it's going to be a surface mount, right here, putting epoxy between those two spots, that would be called a butt joint. But what we want to do is we want to fill in along the edges here, call that a fillet. And a good way to make the fillet nice and smooth is, let me just take that same thing and draw it from the side. Okay, and let's say that this is where the fin is going to be from here. What you can do is you can lay down tape here and lay down tape here. And then you can, in this crease, put in your epoxy, and then with it, like that spoon, just nice scrape until you can get a really nice, good curve so you can get your fillet. Now, it turns out there's a few things that can go wrong. One of which is if you take this thing and put the epoxy in there and then let it dry vertically, because the epoxy will tend to slump down gravitationally. So a much better approach is to actually let it dry horizontally, and not dry horizontally with the fin straight up, but rather dry horizontally with the fin at this angle, because then gravity will help you. And notice I only have epoxy and a fillet on one side. I'll do the other side later when I rotate it. And so, for instance, if you have two fins, you can do these two fillets, this one, and hold it this way, and then rotate it and do this one, and then rotate it and then do this one and this one. So you're doing two fillets at a time, but they're not on either side of the same fin. They're actually adjacent fillets on two different fins. Here's a suggestion. Similarly, let the thing dry horizontally. That's why it's handy to have a cradle, something that will hold the thing off of a surface horizontally for you. And then again, one last thing about the tape. Here's a mistake, and that is to put down your tape and get your epoxy, and the epoxy will spill over onto the tape a little tiny bit. That's okay. And then to let it dry, because then you'll never be able to get the tape off cleanly. What you want to do is get the epoxy just the way it should be, and then take the tape off while the epoxy is still wet. Okay? So learn from the mistakes of others. You can't possibly live long enough to make them all yourself. That's one of my mottos. Okay, fine. Also, and Sophia's going to talk you through some of this. Every rocket build is a bit different, and every instruction set is a bit different. But this particular build suggests putting on the rear centering rings first. But several of the instructions that I've given you for other rockets suggest putting on the rear centering ring last. And there's a good reason for each set of instructions. So you want to follow the instructions that go with the right rocket. Okay, so go ahead and point that towards you. Okay. And then now you get to talk about anything you want to.
Yeah. So I can provide a little bit of advice when it comes to the epoxy.
Before you do, actually, I'm going to address a question that came up in the chat. How do you avoid epoxying the fin alignment guide to the tube? Okay, fair enough. So you have this guide and you're trying to put some epoxy very near it. How are you going to make sure that you don't end up gluing your cardboard to the fin? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so usually what I will do in this instance is I'll put the guide on the tube just initially, just so I have it there. I don't have to worry about that. And what I do is I put, when I'm doing through the wall fins, first you tack it on. So you just put a thin line of epoxy on the edge of the fin there. And then I'll slide it right into the slab.
Do this dry first.
Yeah,
Always dry first and make sure it really fits, and you're not going to struggle with something that's really tight when you have epoxy on it. That's even worse.
Yes, and so you want to do this such that you're not squeezing out epoxy on the sides here. You will worry about doing epoxy fillets another day, but right now you're just tacking it on to the motor mount that's on the inside. So I want this the other way.
This is also important. These fins do have this side forward, and make sure you get the right side forward.
So once I tack them all in, I'm able to just hold it in place like this. So at this point, there shouldn't be any sort of epoxy fillet on the outside here. All the epoxy is on the inside. That's definitely something you want to be careful of, and maybe before you slide the fin guide on, you want to take a second to wipe away any excess epoxy that's squeezed out, if that happened. But I also have the fin guide in such a way that you can, oh, it's kind of the bad side. But you can see there's a little bit of a gap between the fin and the body tube.
Okay, so she's kind of left a gap for a fillet. On the other hand, I would recommend you don't count on that, but rather just don't epoxy all the way up to where the fin guide is. And then once it's dried, then you can take the fin guide off and then you can keep going and it won't ever stick. But yes, this is a worry. And we've all made this mistake. And this is one of the things you want to plan for. Also, don't get any epoxy inside your motor mount tube. So having a motor casing, which I've sent all of you, is a really good thing because that allows you to pretend to put a motor into your tube right off the bat. And if you're struggling to get it in there, in part because you've got some epoxy in there, do something about it right away, because epoxy inside the motor mount tube is death, as in you have to get it out, and that's going to be a lot of elbow grease, which was completely unnecessary if you'd only not done it or noticed it quickly enough to get it off while it was still wet. You know, I forgot one thing on the board, and so I want to show you one more thing, and then I'll come right back to you, Sophia.
Okay.
And that is, what does it look like when you have through hole or through slot? So in that case, what's happening is you have your motor mount tube, and then you have your airframe. And then the idea is the fin is going to go through a slot. And so this particular kit suggests doing this epoxy first and then this epoxy later. Now notice I now have 4 fillets where I used to have only 2. So it's by definition a lot stronger. And you might even imagine getting a 5th and 6th fillet right in there. On the other hand, with this particular build, you might not be able to reach that because this build prevents you from seeing this 5th and 6th location when you get to the right time. So some builds are surface mount, 2 fillets only. 0 fillets, don't go there. That's weak. 2 fillets, but this build will have at least 4, 2 on the inside and 2 on the outside. And the outside ones in particular want to be very aerodynamic. And some builds allow you to even put a 5th and 6th one also on the inside, although this build might not let you do that. That's something to watch for in the difference of the steps, especially if you push your fins through the slots as opposed to slide them up. You'll see what I'm talking about when you do it. If you push the fins through the slots, that might allow you to get a 5th and 6th fillet in. Okay. Let's go back to talking 10 minutes flat,
10
all the way
minutes
through
flat? Oh,
the
boy.
entire. Basically, they have instructions, so frankly, you don't have to assume that they can read, right? So the idea is just talk through the entire airframe build minus the interior of the out bay. We'll get back to out bays later.
Minus, okay. All right. So I've started the first little portion of the airframe. So this might be a good idea to pull out your handy dandy instructions, maybe follow along because they're separated out by chunks. So I started on building the motor mount assembly. Here is where order of epoxying becomes super important. So as you see, one of the first images is figure 1, which is a cutaway view of the motor mount assembly, which eventually will look like something like this. Motor mount tube, you have your aft thrust ring, you have a rear centering ring and a front centering ring. So I've just started the initial part where I epoxied on these last 2 centering rings, because those are what's needed to then go on to the fin can. Once you get to the fin can part, you'll have to sand down your fins. You are given 3 of these fins right here. It is suggested, since it is a sport model, kit rocket that you can round the edges here. So I just took a little bit of sandpaper and lightly rounded the edges so they weren't as sharp. Nothing too fancy. One key thing to note here is don't sand the root edge that you will be using to glue into your rocket. You want that to be as flat as possible. So you don't want to accidentally sand that. Maybe when you get to this step, you know, mark it up, tape it, put an arrow, don't sand that. But once you get your fins ready and your motor mount tube just about ready to go, you actually slide your motor mount into the bottom of the rocket. So you see there, it's all in there. Slots are pre-cut for you, so that's really awesome.
Can I ask you a question? Do
Yes.
you not put the upper centering ring on to hold it centered? Even if it's
Yes.
not glued on, it seems to me you should hold it centered with that.
Yes. So that is something within the instructions as well. They would like you to slide the front centering ring onto the top. Don't epoxy it, not just yet. But that acts as a way to center the tube as you're gluing.
You could tape it on so that it comes back out more easily, for instance.
Yes, as I was going through this, I actually taped it on as well, just because you see it's a pretty looser fit around the motor mount tube, but it's actually a pretty tight fit once you get into the airframe. So sliding that in. Pretend it went all the way up. But yes, it makes it life a lot easier if you tape that centering ring, just because, as you can see, it doesn't like to slide all the way up in front, as it's a pretty tight fit. But once you slide your motor mount tube into the airframe, that's when you can start tacking in your fins. And so that's where this alignment guide would come in handy. In that case, you want to make sure you put a thin line of epoxy on the root edge of the fin. So then when you pop it in there, you're not like squeezing epoxy all over like the outer sides here. Just want enough so you can tack it on strongly. One unique thing I think about this rocket is that once you tack in the fins, you'll actually extend these slots here with an X-Acto knife. That will allow you to actually pull out the fin can assembly again and continue working with this centering ring here.
Okay, so a question came up, can we get a file for the fin guide, which did you laser cut that yourself?
I did.
Sure, Sophia can send out a file if anybody has a laser cutter. If you don't have a laser cutter, don't panic. X-Acto knives work pretty well, but you probably want to do something that you can cut easily, like cardboard, as opposed to she's laser cut something that's basically a wood product.
Yes.
Okay, we can do that.
Okay. Yes. One thing you'll also want to do before you remove the entire fin can is you do want to also mark a line for your launch lug, and that will be done right in between two of the fins, and it will go all the way down to your aft thrust ring here. All right, so you can just use a black Sharpie to do that.
That will be your rail button. I think they call them lugs if they're a tube and a stake goes through that. But in our case, we're using rail buttons, and they came with the rocket. But yes, indeed, the rail buttons need to be between the fins because there's a rail next to them. And so mark a place where your rail buttons are going to go, and don't interfere with the fins.
Yes. And then finally, imagine we have our fins epoxied on. Then we finally get to move on to epoxying on that front centering ring. So before we do that, we also have to make a hole. We have to drill a hole here that will be for our eye bolt assembly. So I believe we've been given forged eye bolts this time, and that will act as a connection point for our recovery parachutes. As seen in the deconstructed rocket over there, we had to have somewhere on our motor retention to attach our recovery system so things don't go flying all around.
And be really careful because you need to tie that before you insert it, because once you insert it, you can't reach it anymore to tie it anymore.
Right. So definitely attach your recovery system before you epoxy this whole thing into your airframe. I've definitely done that before and it caused problems. So
And do the instructions give suggestions on how to get glue, where to put glue, or epoxy inside the airframe while you're sliding this thing in?
so this is slid out at this point.
I know, but when you're sliding it in with,
Oh, yes, it's suggested that you use a dowel
Yep.
to put epoxy on the inside of the airframe. So then when you slide this in, you're not necessarily getting epoxy all over. You just get it where it needs to be. So how that would work, because there's two sets of centering rings, you put a ring on the inside of the tube where it needs to be. Ooh. So the upper centering ring would need epoxy probably above the fin slots here in a ring. You could use a dowel to do that. So then you'd slide that centering ring up. And once it gets past this rear lip here, since this is exactly where the aft centering ring and aft thrust ring will need to be epoxied, you'll have to get an additional dowel to put epoxy on this inner ring here. And then you can continue sliding it in and everything should be epoxied in the place it needs to be.
and if your hands are as small as hers, you can actually reach inside there, but you cannot reach all the way down from the top so as to make that tie. It's
No.
too deep. You've got to have that recovery harness attached before you do this final step.
Right.
Think your way through it. Plan, plan, plan.
Mm-hmm. And once this entire assembly is epoxied in, imagine we have our fins tacked on, then this is where those external fillets come in. So that is what Dr. Flaten was talking about on the board. That's where you can get very nice with your epoxy. You might want to think a little bit more about using the tape method, as well as the spoons given to make those fillets really smooth and reduce any sort of sanding time, because that's never any fun. And you also want enough to create a strong bond on the outside.
So that's the most complicated part of the build is the fin can, and that takes a while, but that's okay. On the other hand, the av bay itself is pretty easy to put together, and we might just talk about how to put that together when we're doing our av bay. That will be an entire lesson. Should we though talk in particular about the nose cone, because we're planning to make a modification to the nose cone.
So if you look at the nose cone here and read the instructions, you'll see that it offers this little hook here as a recovery attachment point.
That's a really bad idea.
Yes.
Way too weak.
Yeah. So what we'll do as a replacement, kind of what was done here is replacing, you see there's a hole here, replacing that with a forged eye bolt. And that gives us a way stronger way of doing our recovery system. So that is one minor modification that we will be making to this kit, just to make sure everything is as strong as it should be.
And why the hole in the side? What's that for? Can't you just screw the eye bolt up that central hole?
So if you look in here, you'll see there's also, ooh, okay,
Hold it upside down.
upside down.
Yeah, there you go. Now you can
Oh,
if you
there we
look
go.
inside there, you'll see there's a nut inside there.
Yes.
The hole mostly is to allow you to reach in and get that nut on.
Mhm.
So don't damage your shoulder too much, because you still want it to seal above and below the hole. The hole has to be big enough for your fingers and a pliers, literally a pliers, to go in there, because that nut, a lock nut, you can't put on by hand. You have to put it on with tools.
Yes. Let me think.
When tying the recovery harnesses is not too hard to the top of the ab bay, to the bottom of the ab bay, to the nose cone, but it has to be done in advance
Mhm.
at the fin cam. That's the one part that you can't reach. And
Yes.
take pictures of all of this stuff as you go, because some of it you won't be able to see after the fact, and you'll need those pictures for your final report.
I think this does a nice exploded view just to drill in like why you need to attach that recovery point. As you can see, we are doing the dual deploy rocket here. Here is the bottom recovery attachment point. as you can see, you would need to stick your arm all the way down this tube to tie that if you glued in your motor mount before attaching it. And that's kind of impossible. So make sure you tie that recovery point before inserting this whole fin can and epoxying it in. And then, as you can see, that connects up to the one end of the avionics bay. And then there's another attachment to the other side of the avionics bay, all the way up to the nose. And we will be changing that connection point to our forged eye bolt.
There'll be 4 forged eye bolts, one on either end of the av bay. You'll need to modify the av bay if necessary to accommodate these kinds of bolts instead of the ones that came with the kit. And you will need to, modify that centering ring because it does not have a hole in it yet, but you need to put a hole in it for that bolt at the bottom. And then put the nylon lock nuts on each of these forged eye bolts so they don't come off ever. They might say in the instructions to glue them. That's really not necessary if you're using lock nuts, but one way or another, you don't want any of those bolts to come off, especially the ones you can't reach, because if they come off where you can't reach it, you can't fix it either. What else about the instructions? As you have been looking, you haven't done all of them, but do you have any other comments about the instructions, things to watch out for, other things that we might modify?
I think a lot of the things to watch out for I have immediately with this step, because this is the first one that I've done. So in this kit, you'll actually have 3 different ring-like wooden materials presented in your kit. One thing to be extra sure about is that the 2 centering rings are the same size, but then the thrust ring is actually a little bit bigger. And as you can kind of see here, the thrust ring is just a smidge bigger. So I'd say first thing you do when you take out your kit is to mark the thrust ring, just to make absolutely sure nobody glues it in the wrong spot. Because as you can see, the centering ring is supposed to pop into the tube, but the thrust ring is supposed to stay outside.
Right, so the thrust ring cannot penetrate the airframe and hence will allow you to thrust against it.
Right.
So here's the test. We haven't done this test before. Here's a motor casing. Does it go in? If it doesn't go in, you've got a problem.
It does.
It's got to go in.
Yes.
So if you have done too much epoxy and it won't go in, fix that right away. Or if not right away, fix it before you install it in the motor, in the rocket, because it'll be harder to fix it once it's installed. Make sure that your casing goes into your motor mount tube.
Yes.
Always.
Yes, so when doing the epoxy for the aft thrust ring, just do a thin enough line right above the edge of the motor mount, just so it doesn't all like squeeze out and go into the tube, and if it does, wipe it out right away, because you don't want to be sanding that out. Additionally, you don't want too much of a fillet on top of your aft thrust ring when you assemble it, because shortly after that, you're going to have to slide on this rear centering ring. And if there's this huge thick fillet right above your thrust ring, you're not going to be able to slide that rear centering ring on. So just make sure you don't have like huge fillets on either side, as that's going to poorly affect the fit. And then once you put this rear centering ring on, so they're supposed to stick together. And once you do that, some epoxy might squeege out. Make sure to also wipe that away, as again, this rear centering ring has to fit into the rocket, and it's already a snug fit as is. So if you have any extra epoxy, it's not going to fit, and you're going to have to sand that out.
So it turns out that the fillets we're talking about are mostly for the fins and not so much for the centering rings. In fact, you can almost get away without gluing the centering rings at all. They're just to hold something in the center. They're not supposed to necessarily carry much force at all, but we will use epoxy. Just make sure that you think through where not to put epoxy, because as Sophia was mentioning, some things are supposed to eventually slide together and touch each other. And if there's epoxy in the way, that will not work. And if you have a lot of epoxy and then 2 things touch each other, it'll start to squeeze out, and that could get in your way. So be ready to wipe it up, and maybe even sand it off if necessary.
Yes, I think those are my main pieces of advice for these first few sections, but it does carry over to the larger instructions of the rocket, just making sure you get epoxy in the right places.
A couple comments from me. One is be careful about these fins. These fins are not as asymmetrical as some fins are, and one could pretty easily imagine putting them on backwards. I'm not saying that would be terrible, but frankly, it would not fly the way it was supposed to if the fins were on backwards, and certainly don't put the fins on some of them forward, some of them backwards, so that the fins don't match each other. That would be even worse. Also, what else was I going to say? Oh, yes. So Sophia is going to be, and maybe has already started, taking pictures of her progress, and she will make a slide deck. And so as soon as I get a link to that, I will make that available. And that slide deck will continue to grow. As she does more steps, she'll add more pictures, and there will be more slides. And we won't draw your attention to this every time it changes. I'll just give you a link. It'll be a Google Doc or something like that, so that you should just check her slide deck once in a while, as in pretty regularly. And she'll stay ahead of you. So within a week's time, she'll have probably more done than you will in a week's time. But within 3 weeks' time, I want everybody to be completely done. Sophia might be done in less than 3 weeks' time. Pay attention to the instructions. The instructions are pretty good. We're going to make some small tweaks to them, but the instructions are pretty good, and we won't deviate from them intentionally unless we think we can do better. So if we don't say something, that doesn't mean don't do it. That means do it as instructed. So we're coming up on the end of our supposed 1 hour time slot. These lessons go fast, at least for us. Are there questions? Remember, the first thing we want from you as soon as possible, definitely no later than Monday, and how about tomorrow would be better than Monday, frankly, is think through all your steps and the order in which they need to be done and how long it's going to take for this to dry and this to dry, et cetera, et cetera. Make yourself a schedule and then show us your schedule. And we'll try to give you some feedback on your schedule and then stick to the schedule. But questions? If there are no questions, I have failed dramatically because it can't be that clear. It can't be that clear. So I really do want questions.
I have a question, but it's more about the tube that I received in the mail.
Okay, what about it?
The book that you put in there got a little bit loose, and it kind of rattled around in a way that caused some of it to get a little, like the back end, the little pieces of cardboard behind the fins. They got incredibly stressed, and it looks like they've warped a bit. Like the tube was pushed down in the back somewhat. Is that going to be a problem?
Actually, it won't. And the reason is, in the back end, the tube has been damaged by the fact that there are fin slots in it. And you're going to fix that by gluing in something which is way stronger than the tube. You just have to make sure when you glue it in and all is said and done, it's not warped at all anymore. Okay. If you think you can't pull that off, we can talk. But my suggestion is make sure that you end up with a rocket that looks right, even if things got a little squashed or something. Sorry about that in transport.
All right.
By all means, send me some photos of what you're talking about, and I might say, no, you can't fix that. We'll have to figure something else out. But my guess is you can fix it.
Okay.
Okay, question from Bethel. Can we use a different motor retainer? Can we use rail guides, slides, instead of buttons? So those are two different questions. And the answer is yes, actually. So, but here's the deal. If you want to use a different type of motor retention, it might change the instructions. So for instance, this motor retention, which I hadn't seen before, and I'm looking forward to seeing how well it works, and I think it'll be fine, requires you to take your thrust ring and aft centering ring and put them at the very bottom of the motor mount tube. Other types of motor retention, what I call the expensive motor retention in particular, requires that the motor mount tube stick out below the bottom centering ring. That's a change. That's a big difference, and you can't do both. You have to do one or the other. So if you're going to use a different kind of motor retention, I would suggest that you talk us through what you have in mind and make sure we all agree what you're doing. So this is part of your plan. On the other hand, I don't really recommend you use a different one. I think you should use this one, but if you really want to use another one, we should probably have a separate chat just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And you probably won't end up gluing your centering rings to the very end of your motor mount tube. As far as rail guides, if you want to purchase, or maybe you have some around, you can use those instead. The rail buttons that are provided are fine, and I would suggest you use them, but I will not require it. On the other hand, at some point, you need to make a list of the changes you made, and you want to justify why you chose to go with rail guides instead of rail buttons. There are some reasons for doing that. I will leave it up to you to convince the judges, if you're in the competition, convince the judges that this was a positive step that you made. Other questions? Okay, so that last question in part came from a team that already has some rockets and has some parts and has some other ideas, and that's fine. I'm not really expecting most teams to deviate from the parts that we've provided, and we're not providing you with rail guides. On the other hand, what got added to the Meteor rocket by Sophia actually recently was rail guides, in part because it was too late to put rail buttons in. You had to put rail buttons in while it was being built. Somehow they got removed. I don't know why that happened, and so she had to fix it with rail guides. It was a after the fact fix. No, that was not the original plan. Okay, check out the documents that are posted, and as they change, in particular, as Sophia gives me places to point you to, I will update the documents, and we'll get a copy of a link to this video recording out to you. In fact, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to make a document that has direct links to these Zoom video recordings, and that will grow as well. And so I'll link last week's recording, I'll link this week's recording, and later ones. On the other hand, these links only last for a few months, and then Zoom takes them down, actually. So I'm also going to keep copies of the original recording, so you don't have to do a Zoom link, but you can go on see the original recording, but that would be a significant download. So using the links is fine and will work okay for the next few weeks, but it won't work next year. If somebody wants to come back and look at these lessons in a year's time, some new person on your team, that's great. Not going to be quite so smooth, but there will be a workaround. Okay, thanks again, everybody. Have a good night. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you very much. Have a nice night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Flaten and Sophia.
Bye-bye.